As far as I'm concerned, the only real way to learn how to organize an asynchronous case discussion is to participate in some. And so the core of this faculty workshop will be built around participating in an asynchronous discussion of plagiarism in the class project. The purpose of this presentation is just to give you a little insight into what you will be experiencing and also show you some of the things that you might have to deal with on the faculty side of an asynchronous case discussion. Now, throughout our workshop, we'll be proceeding using the discussion organization that I have found to be most effective after having conducted hundreds of these asynchronous discussions. You will likely develop your own techniques over time, but as a starting point, this particular discussion framework that I'm presenting usually works pretty well and does not put a huge burden on the faculty member, which is one of the challenges you often face in asynchronous courses. So in this presentation, I'm going to be going over a number of things. We'll start with a definition of asynchronous case discussions. We will then take a quick look at the threaded discussion tool, particularly from the faculty's perspective. We'll talk a little bit about some of the setup options that you might apply in Moodle, which is the tool that they use at INCAE. We'll talk a little bit about the conduct of the discussion and particularly the role of the faculty member, which is something that's likely to vary considerably based on individuals' temperaments. And then we'll finally look at some of the strategies for wrapping up a discussion. And I'll give you an example of a video wrap-up that I prepared for this particular case. I'll talk about post-case evaluations that I have the students do. And I'll talk a little bit about grading your students, which is very, very important in these types of discussions, because if students do not believe that you are looking for a good discussion and are instead looking for something like a lot of posts or a certain number of words, then that's all you're going to get. A lot of posts and a certain number of words. And so you really have to make it clear that you care very, very much about the quality of the discussion. But when you do, you will often be surprised by how high it is. When you are facilitating a discussion of a teaching case, or as I prefer to call them, a discussion case, there are a lot of things that you need to think about. And we'll start with the context, because this is quite different from the classroom context. For one thing, the discussion will take place over an extended period of time. It is time and place agnostic, which means that you cannot count on people all being there and accessing the discussion at the same time. That's what makes it asynchronous. And then finally, there's class size. In a normal class discussion, you can have a good class discussion with classes of many different sizes. I find in our school that a number of about 20 is optimal, but at places like Harvard Business School, they have as many as 80 students in a class, and those discussions are also very adequate. When you start dealing with asynchronous discussions using a tool like Moodle, you're much, much more sensitive to class size, because the discussions can get absolutely massive and very repetitive if you have too many people hitting the same discussion. Another thing that we need to think about is the tools. And most learning management systems, such as Moodle, have something that is called a discussion forum or a discussion, and allows for threading. And threading means that instead of just having a stream of posts the way you do on something like Facebook, you can reply to specific posts, and when you look at the discussion, you can see that this person replied to this specific post as opposed to being just a general stream of one response after another. And this allows for a lot of parallelism to take place in the discussion, and that's something that an asynchronous discussion allows that you can't get in a regular classroom discussion or a synchronous online discussion. We also have the conduct of the discussion. I already talked about parallelism. there's a real question as to how much instructor participation you want to have in an asynchronous discussion. Now, this is true in the classroom as well. Some instructors are very directive and are basically in charge and talking for more than half the class, and some are really good at getting the discussion to move along just with things like body language and gestures. In the asynchronous discussion, essentially you have a same choice. You can participate heavily in the discussion or you can stand back from it. What's different, however, is when you stand back from the discussion in an asynchronous situation, the students have no idea whether you're paying attention or not. Whereas in the classroom, they can always look at you. And even online synchronous discussions, you can make it very clear that you're there. But when you go asynchronous, they have no idea whether you're paying attention or not. Finally, there's the question of how to close out the discussion. In the classroom discussion, it's natural to have a summary at the end where you sort of highlight what you think was important about the case and important about the discussion. There's no such natural closing in an asynchronous discussion, so you have to create something that will do the closing for you. Finally, there is the question of assessing. How do you grade these discussions, and how do you determine if students are learning anything from them? So I'll talk a little bit about that near the end of this presentation, and hopefully when we reach the end of the workshop, if people have specific questions for me, you'll be able to raise them and I can hopefully give some sort of satisfactory answer to them, though I make no guarantees on that. Okay, I'm going to hide myself for a while and show you a couple of videos that I created on setting up discussions in Moodle and adjusting some of the settings. Be aware that Moodle is not a tool that I use routinely, but the philosophy behind these setups is common to almost all learning management systems, and you can always use the resources at INCAE to help you with the specifics of your own Moodle installation. Now we'll take a quick look at the processes involved of creating a new discussion in Moodle. My assumption is that everyone in this workshop is familiar with the basic operation of Moodle, but just as a quick review, if you're trying to create a case discussion, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to your course, and you're likely to have some topics here. In Spanish, the wording is somewhat different. And you'll need to turn your editing on. That will give you the ability to add things, and we'll just add a discussion to this topic here. So what we would do is we would click on Add an Activity or Resource. We would then come down here, and the asynchronous discussion is going to typically be the forum. We click on Add. It will take us to our general forum. We'll just call this Test Add Sample Discussion. And then we can use the standard forum for general use. We'll put a description on the course page, and then we will save and return to the course. And now we've created a forum. Once we've done that, you'll notice these things are kind of grayed out. What we would need to do is we would need to get the thing actually set up. So first thing we can do is make this topic visible. We could then go into the summary for the topic, and we'll choose a different name from topic 6, adding a forum. I'm a lame typist, but adding a forum, this demonstrates adding a forum, which is fairly obvious. We then click on Save Changes. Now you see our topic name has changed to adding a forum. We have this in here. We can then go over here, make it visible. So that show here makes it visible. And then what we can do is we can go in and add some discussion topics. And in the case of a forum like this, when you're doing a case, I strongly recommend running the discussion in parallel. So if you have a set of case questions, maybe I usually go between 5 and 8 questions, what you can then do is add each one as a separate discussion topic, and then you can assign people to open the case. So this is the asynchronous version of case opening. Now, when you've got all these topics going in parallel, what it does is it allows the case to proceed much more smoothly over the course of a week. So what I'll just do is create some examples of what topics might be. You know, I might give the person's name here, or I might call this industry, and then I might say explain how the industry impacts the decision. And then I can, if I choose to, I can get email copies sent to me every time someone posts to the forum. That's going to create a lot of email traffic, so I might select this not. On the other hand, if you're just getting started with a group, it's probably a good idea to get those emails because that way you know people are actually acting. So I go post to the forum. And now what will happen is that people can respond to this. And so we'll add another discussion topic, culture, you know, bad typing. Okay, culture. Yeah, how does culture impact the decision? Okay, it's giving me the same defaults. I'll post it to the forum, and then well, I'll just do one more. There's no reason to do a bunch more. Okay, I don't know why we got that one. I might have typed something inadvertently. Okay, subject, we'll say this decision, something like what option specified in the case would you select and why? And then we can post this one up. And obviously these questions are going to be case specific. And so you design the questions specifically for the case. And what I recommend is that for each case you discuss online, you assign a specific topic to a specific student to open. And then the rest of the group has to reply to that topic. And I always let the openers go back and forth with the replies. And then over the course of a whole semester, if you do say 10 cases, everyone will have a chance to open several cases. If you've got a very small class, as I did once, I always had 7 topics and I had 7 students. So everybody opened every case and then the discussion proceeds. So let's take a quick look at some of the options you might set when establishing a discussion forum for a case study. And all of these options have to be considered in light of the fact that I never use Moodle for this. We have a different learning management system at my school. And so in many cases, I am actually speculating on what these things will do. And so as our sessions progress, we may find that there are better settings. When you open up the discussion forum, the general option is open, where you give a name to the forum, and you can click display a description on a course page, which I think is a good idea. It makes it easier for students to see what is coming up. And I think the standard forum for general use is probably a good choice for a normal discussion. Now, what we'll do to look at the other options is we will click on Expand All, And that will open up all these options below. And then I'll quickly go over what I think each one is for. And once again, I'm not a Moodle user, so I might be slightly off on some of these. Uh, I normally don't want my students uploading files to a regular case discussion. I just want them typing things in, so I've got uploads are not allowed here. I think the default for this one is 500K. It doesn't really matter if students do uploads, but you want the forum to be as easy for everybody to read as possible. And if you have to open documents to read student posts, then that makes it harder. I don't see any particular reason to display a word count here for students. I don't like mechanical ways of giving students a sense of how much they've posted, because then they start to think, well, okay, I can stop after I've reached a certain number of words, or I can stop after I've reached a certain number of posts. And what that tends to do is produce a bloated forum, and is usually not what you want. In your normal learning management system, subscription sends out emails to students. So if they subscribe to a forum, as people add stuff to the forum, emails go out. I think optional subscription is good. Some people like the notion of being emailed every time, but a lot of these discussions, in my experience, go up over 100 posts, and you can literally swamp your email with that. Now, if you're used to working with email systems like Outlook, one of the things you can do is you can redirect emails from the forum into a special mailbox, and that may make it a little easier. But normally, for a forum like this, I would not have a subscription. On the other hand, if I had a question and answer forum, I probably would. Post threshold for blocking. This is essentially gives you a number of days, and I don't really know what the purpose of this particular one is. According to the help system, it basically limits the number of posts that students can make, and I've never found that to be a problem. That's not a feature I use in my learning management system. Grade category, you can set up grade categories in Moodle. I don't, so the only option I have here is uncategorized. Ratings allows students to rate posts, and I've actually used this in other systems. My current system, Canvas, doesn't have this feature, but the ratings can be a nice way of helping you grade, and so students can assign ratings to posts, and then when you're trying to make your assessment of posts, you can look at these ratings, and that will give you a better sense of how people are reacting to individual posts. Once again, when you're grading these forums, one of the things you do not want to do is simply count posts, because that's a surefire way of getting lots and lots of posts that say very little and usually begin with "I agree." Common module settings, show and hide, focused on Moodle, and I'm really not sure what it's used for. The restricting access is a tool that will allow you to set the discussions on and off. I certainly tend to set a start date for access and an end date for my forums, simply so that students don't keep posting past the point where I have evaluated the forum. You can also set up various grading conditions, which I typically don't do. Activity completion. Moodle has the ability for students to mark that they're done with a particular activity. The option here is students can manually mark. You can also have do not indicate activity completion. That would probably be what I would do, because I normally set the forums for a case discussion open for a specific period of time. So once that time is over, students are completed with the activity. And if a student doesn't post to the forum, I don't care whether that student says they're completed or not. I do not necessarily check off these things. These are mechanical ways of determining if students have interacted. Normally in a case discussion, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to the discussion than that, so I would not normally set these things on. So that is my general take on these, and when we have discussions online about the forum, we may decide that given specific circumstances, some of these options might well be set differently. Once you've decided that your options are okay, you can save and return to the course, and then what happens is your forum is added. I put this in an undefined topic that I'm just using for testing purposes. Once you've created a discussion with the appropriate settings, it becomes relatively easy to add new top-level threads. You just go into the discussion and then you have this option to add a new discussion topic. And here you can see the 8 questions that I created for the plagiarism and the class project discussion that we will be having. Personally, I'm no big fan of teaching notes, but teaching notes for case studies will often provide you with a number of questions that you could use to launch a forum. For my own purposes, I typically just come up with a list myself, and it's usually somewhere between 6 and 8 questions. And what they tend to do is they tend to follow a theme such that the later questions all relate to broad, big picture questions about the decision, whereas the earlier questions tend to address the context. And what I find often in these discussions is we get a lot more activity on the early questions early and the later questions later in the discussion. So here's just some example that I use for plagiarism in the class project. I begin by asking a question involving facts of the case and your interpretation of them. Were the actions described by Grandin in the case appropriate or not? And we're looking for students to do some evaluation and decide whether it makes sense or not. Then we have a question about the context. Is this something appropriate for students? Is it reasonable to do a project like this, a big picture question about the assignment? We then have some questions about the explanations of the student. Now, one of the things you'll notice is all of these questions require some conceptual thinking and judgment. We never ask a question that's specifically about case facts because anybody can look those things up. So we're looking for questions that will make them think a little bit going on. I ask about the role of cultural factors. That obviously is going to have a subjective component to it. I ask, is the resolution fair? Whenever you deal with a question of fairness, I can almost guarantee that you're going to get very, very different levels of responses from students. Go on to ask about the factors that make the situation more serious and less serious. And then a couple of questions dealing with the real fundamental questions of the case. How does the detection of copying on all these other chapters impact the case? This is a huge impact potentially, because if you have to flunk everyone in a course, that is not going to be something an administration will typically tolerate. They'll blame the instructor for that. And so at the same time, the fact the problem is widespread may mean that you need to make an example of folks. So this is another type of fundamental question. And finally, what would you recommend Grandin do? Which is practically always a question I will ask in the case, not about Grandin, but about the protagonist. What should the protagonist do? Because we always want to keep people focused on the decision that needs to be made in the cases. So this is just an example, but all 8 of these threads can go reasonably well in parallel. They're not incredibly dependent upon each other, but in a certain sense they do build a little bit so that we tend to see more action in the early questions at the beginning of the discussion and in the later questions towards the end of it. So what are some of the key issues that you always need to be thinking about when you're conducting an asynchronous discussion? Well, the first thing is you need a reasonable set of openings. If the openings to your threads are not posted on time, if the questions you ask are not all that relevant to the case, that's really going to interfere with the ability of the participants to build it into a reasonable discussion. Now, Another thing you need to be think about is responding. How much do you want to be involved in the discussion? And when I did my first asynchronous discussion, I became involved a lot. I wanted them to know that I was really heavily engaged in the discussion. And what ended up happening is it ended up almost becoming a dialogue between me and 24 individual students. This went on for a week, and by the end of the week, I'd probably invested 20 hours in discussing the case. I was exhausted, the students were exhausted, and it really had become the Socratic method and not a true case discussion where peers are responding to each other. What I often do in my case is I say, under no circumstances will I respond to a post in earlier than 24 hours after it's posted. And what that does is it gives other students the opportunity to respond to a post before I come in. Frankly, I have discovered that even when I am involved practically not at all in the discussion, a good discussion transpires if I set up the ground rules properly. And that's how I'm going to handle the discussion here. I'm going to be involved very, very little. In fact, there are dangers in both over and under involvement. As I talked about, if you're over involved in the discussion, it's going to turn into a dialogue. Every time you make a statement, students are going to agree with you, and you will be so exhausted that by the end of the semester you will guarantee to your administration that you will quit if you ever are assigned another one of these courses. On the other hand, if you're under involved, you may still have a very good discussion, but your student evaluations may be absolutely terrible because they don't believe that you've done anything. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, I think there are things that you can do in terms of closing out the discussion such that the students feel that there was real benefit to having you leading the course and facilitating the discussion without necessarily you're being involved in every post that takes place while the discussion is going on. Another issue is setting clear expectations. I've mentioned this a couple of times in the welcome slides. If you are not clear in what you expect your students to do, and in particular, if you give them the impression that you're grading them based upon the number of posts or the number of words or the size of words or whatever unimportant criteria that you have, you will get that criteria, but you won't get a good discussion. And so I'll give you some examples of some of the things that I use to try to make it very clear what I am looking for. Another thing you need to think about is monitoring and feedback. This again deals with the question of responding, but also case discussions can get derailed. How often do you need to look at the discussion and how much feedback do you need to give them while the discussion's going on versus after the discussion? And what I tend to do is I tend to be very, very heavily involved in giving feedback after the discussions, especially the early discussions. Each student gets a detailed comment from me on their overall participation for each discussion. Then, as the semester progresses, I only need to make comments on those students who seem to have a problem with a particular discussion. And once again, that seems to satisfy the students in terms of my level of engagement. Finally, there is the question of the number of posts versus class size. As I have mentioned already several times, these discussions can get very large. It is very rare that I have a discussion that doesn't end up being 60 or 50 single-space pages over the course of a week. That is a lot of text. And the larger the class, the larger the discussion will necessarily become. What I do is I break up large classes into smaller groups and grade each discussion separately. So instead of having one big discussion, I will have 3 independent discussions, and they will be graded independently. It's like having 3 class sections. But 3 good discussions are much better than 1 large, cumbersome discussion. And they don't take that much work, because I would say with asynchronous discussions, the workload is pretty much proportional to the number of students that you have. So if you've got a very large class, whether you've got it all one discussion or whether you break it up into groups of separate discussions, the workload is not going to be that different. But I think the learning is a lot better when you keep the groups small. And I would say when they get over 25, I start to get very nervous. I've included a copy of my syllabus in the course Moodle site, but what I want to do here is just show you the actual instructions that I put in my syllabus when I am telling students about an online case discussion and the role of each particular guideline I give students. So the first thing I emphasize is I'm looking for a discussion, not a collection of however many pieces of individual work I'm getting. So if I've got 50 students in a class, I don't want to get 50 separate analyses of the case. I want to have a discussion that builds on everyone's analysis. And of course, if I had 50 students, I'd probably break it into 2 or 3 groups and have 2 or 3 separate discussions as per the last slide. So the first question I say is, when I'm grading, I look to see, are you responding to another student's comments? And what I encourage people to do is name the student whose comments they're referring to so that we can see that it is a response to a comment, and that makes it much easier for me as a grader, let me tell you, if I know who he or she is responding to. I tell them that agreeing with the previous post, if you don't add anything, is not going to add anything to your overall participation grade because it just adds noise to the discussion. Disagreeing with the previous post, especially if there's any kind of reasonable justification or argument, is viewed in a very positive light. I want a discussion. I want to have people disagreeing with each other. And by making that explicit, students will actually do that. Whereas even in cultures where such disagreement would not normally be tolerated in a work setting, and I would say some of the Asian cultures fit that mold, when they're told they're going to be graded for disagreeing, it's remarkable how disagreeable they become. I indicate here you don't want to repeat what somebody else says. That's just like agreeing, and I want people to always strive to add something new. Now, one of the things this encourages people to do is to participate closer to the beginning of the discussion, because the earlier the idea is posted, the more likely it hasn't already been said multiple times. I encourage people to make specific references to case facts, just as I do in a classroom context. I would give the same feedback in a classroom. And I also will allow them to reference outside sources. Some instructors really don't like it when their students go outside the case. I've got no problem with it at all. I like to see that kind of energy. And so what if they discover how a particular decision turned out? That doesn't mean that that was inevitable. And it doesn't mean there isn't an even better decision that could have been made. And then finally, and this I have found to be extremely useful, and I strongly encourage people to use this as a guideline, I tell people that if their posts appear to have all been made at one setting, and I guarantee you a bunch of students will do this, they'll sit down some evening, in the case of my students, usually like 2 a.m. in the morning, and they'll rattle off 45 minutes worth of posts to every stream. Well, that all appears on the clock, because the posts are date stamped. And when I see a bunch of posts together, in my comments I say, well, you could have gotten a much better grade if you'd actually spread your posts out over the discussion. Because if everybody posts in bursts, you're not having a discussion, you're just having collections of bursts. And so that we really want the interaction. And when the students understand this is a very clear expectation, then they will normally come in and post 2, 3, 4 times over the course of a discussion. And it actually makes the quality of the discussion much better. And one of the comments I will make is that when I have showed some of the discussions out of my classes to our Advanced Center for Teaching and Learning, or whatever we're calling it these days, they have been absolutely shocked at the quality of these discussions. And I really think that a lot of it just has to do with me making the expectations very, very clear. So when you're conducting an asynchronous discussion, really think about it from the student's perspective, because most of our students absolutely crave feedback. And in an asynchronous discussion, feedback can be very difficult to give. So within the discussion itself, some of the sources of feedback are asking questions within the discussion. I strongly recommend you do not give opinions if you participate asynchronously, because as soon as you make a statement of opinion, you will get immediate convergence from the students. Everyone will agree with you, whether or not they actually do. I've seen this happen many times, and so I find it a really bad idea to give opinions. I will ask questions. And sometimes if I don't like the way the discussion is going, or if I really like the way the discussion is going, I'll add a new thread and make some general comments about the discussion and what I'd like to see changed or what I'd like to see a little bit more activity on, and that gives the students some feedback as to what I'm looking for, as opposed to jumping into the discussion right away. Now, once the discussion is over, an important source of feedback is the way you wrap up the case. And you can do this in text, or you could do it, as I sometimes do, in video. What I like to do in my traditional discussion organization is, as soon as the discussion ends, the discussion itself ends, I have a video that appears. You can set the timing so the video will appear automatically at the time the discussion ends. And in that video, I give some general comments about what I'm looking for. And I can prepare these videos in advance, as I did for this case. I prepared the plagiarism video in advance. What I then do is I post it before I look for individual student wrap-ups, so that they can incorporate my feedback into their own analysis of the case. Now, that does tend to produce a little bit more convergence. It's very rare if I state an opinion that the students will not agree with it, sadly enough, because I'm so often wrong. But nevertheless, that way they feel that I have been involved in their learning, and they do not believe that I am not involved in the course, which is, I say, one of the big dangers of asynchronous. Finally, I think it is incredibly important, particularly in early discussions, because a lot of your students will never have done an asynchronous discussion of a case before, is you really need to give them feedback. And your grade books give you the ability to write comments. The system that I use, Canvas, actually allows me to create video comments. So for the first discussion, I create a 1 or 2 minute video comment for each student. Yes, it takes some time. You know, if my current class has 60 students in it, most of the videos are about 1.5 minutes long, but say you double that for prep time and reading the students' comments and stuff, 3 or 4 minutes per student times 60 students is 4 hours. It's 4 hours of agony, but the students incredibly appreciate it, and all of a sudden they feel like they're getting a level of interaction online that they could never get in the classroom, because they don't really get a lot of individual feedback in a normal case discussion class. I tend to avoid grading scales that are unambiguous. Now notice I said unambiguous. In other words, I want an ambiguous grading scale. I want a grading scale that the students really don't understand. And the reason for this is they freak out about grades. And so I use a scale that's very vague. And I've actually found, when I surveyed students, that they're perfectly happy to have vague grading and flexibility on my part and all this type of thing, as long as I specify that in advance. And I have been told by numerous instructors that their students are not that way, but I will comment that their students, in the case of my school, are the same students that I'm teaching. So I believe it's being asked and being given a sense as to why you're being a little ambiguous that is important in terms of getting your students to buy into this. Because whenever you have a discussion class, if your students don't buy into it, you're in trouble from the very start. As I mentioned, I provide video feedback for the first case or so, and then after that, what I do is I make an announcement. Well, you guys are doing so well, I'm only going to give feedback to the people, who I've evaluated as being weak this particular week. And what that does is it dramatically reduces the amount of feedback I have to do, and it means I'm giving feedback to the folks who aren't already doing great. And finally, be sure what you reward, what you ask for. It's really easy. In fact, some learning management systems allow you to assign grades based on the number of posts. And that's really easy. That cuts the 4-hour grading chore down to about 30 seconds. But If you start rewarding people on the number of posts or rewarding them for posting versus not posting, then what will happen is the quality of your posts will go down. And so grading is the area in these asynchronous discussions that takes a lot of time. But if you put in that time, you can get some really excellent performance and learning. So how do you actually know if your students are learning? Well, the best way I figure is to ask them. And so at the end of every case, and I do this for both asynchronous and synchronous cases, I always have them fill out a case reflection form. And the case reflection form always asks the same 2 questions. What were the 3 most important things you learned from the case? And how did the case discussion change your understanding of the case? And so after every case discussion, my students have to fill this in. Now, in an asynchronous discussion, what I do is I have them fill it in a couple of days after the discussion ends, so they have the opportunity to look at my closing video or my wrap-up video, as I talked about, because they can definitely incorporate that into their overall learning. But by reading these things, one of the things that I can do is I can tell if the discussions are having any effect. If they can't answer the question of how their discussion changed their understanding, then there wasn't any point in having a discussion. The whole purpose of a case discussion is not so that people can demonstrate how well they prepared the case. It's so that their understanding of the case can change as a result of interaction with their peers. And these things take very little time to grade. I typically find I can grade about 1 a minute. So even in a large course, it's not a huge burden to assess these. But as long as you keep assessing them, students will keep thinking about what they're learning even as the discussion goes on, because they know they're going to have to fill out that form and they want to do well on it. Now, if you have a reasonably large asynchronous discussion, one of the things that you can actually do in an asynchronous discussion that you cannot do in a classroom discussion is provide feedback on different groups that everybody can see, so you can become completely transparent in your assessment. And I think there's some big advantages to that as far as the student is concerned, because it allows you to express what you're looking for and gives them examples at the same time. Now, the reason I think it's particularly easy to do this in asynchronous mode is because you can engage in a process that effectively makes responses anonymous. And the way I have done this in the past is I begin by randomly dividing the class into 4 or more groups for each discussion. And it's important that every discussion is different. So each week, nobody knows who's in any group but their own group. And so I send out emails each week telling students who's in their group with them, and I tell them not to tell anyone else who's in their group. And if you want to actually create these things quickly, the rand function, which generates a random number in a spreadsheet, is very helpful. You do a rand and a sort, and every week you can get a different set of randomly created groups. Now, once you've sent out the group emails, you give them a set of instructions to send you a single group closing. And I usually put a tight word limit on it, maybe 250 words or possibly 500 words. And I actually count the words in Word in order to make sure that they haven't exceeded it. And they need to get this thing submitted to me by private email every week by a specified time. And it's also possible to create groups using the function within the learning management system. The key thing is you want to create a different group every week. So you send out the email, and it's up to them to figure out how they're going to communicate with each other to create the closing. They always find a way, and I've found this to be true in every distance learning course that I've taught. Then what happens is you write your own wrap-up of the case, and you take the individual responses from the group and you write an open assessment of each one, but you only identify the groups by number. So you give an assessment of group 1, of group 2, of group 3, of group 4, and you include the text that they sent you. That way everybody can see how you assess the groups, but you haven't violated anyone's privacy because they don't know who's in the other group. They only know who's in their own group. And when you do this, what happens is you can post these things to your learning management system. And I think I gave you an example of one of those posts on the Moodle forum. And it provides a nice way of giving individualized feedback, but you can do it at a group level. And the students, really appreciate that, and also they can study how you evaluated other groups, and that will give them a much clearer idea of what you're looking for in your grading. So I've talked a lot about assessing learning in the online case method course using asynchronous forums, but I haven't really given you any evidence of it. And frankly, assessing learning in any case discussion course is very difficult. And the reason for that is the purpose of a case discussion course is to help the students improve judgment. And judgment is very, very hard to measure. It's something like creativity. You might know it when you see it, but it's really, really hard to figure out who's got it and what they've learned that produces it. At any rate, back in 2011, we got a grant from the National Science Foundation to develop a face-to-face undergraduate capstone course using all our same cases. So this was effectively a pure case method course. Well, that isn't exactly true. It was half case method and half one big project. And so we ran it in face-to-face mode for quite a number of semesters, and because it was funded with a grant, we needed to use some sort of learning instruments to help us assess the learning, and we chose something called the Student Assessment of Learning Gains. And what the Student Assessment of Learning Gains does is it asks students to do a self-assessment of learning on a whole bunch of different criteria that we can specify. So we looked at the criteria that we kind of expected cases to be good at, and understanding MIS concepts, understanding real-world issues, problem solving, and so forth. And we asked students to assess themselves on a scale of 1 to 5 on each of these. And based on the literature where this instrument has been used, a score of 3 or better is usually considered pretty good. So we administered the instrument for the first time in spring of 2012. And what you can see is in this face-to-face class, the results were really quite good. I mean, 3 is supposed to be good, and our lowest was 3.5, and we had a whole bunch of them in the mid-4s and even the high 4s for understanding real-world issues. So you really can't complain about those results. So we administer it again in fall 2012, and lo and behold, we get relatively similar results, with the possible exception of improving technical skills, which is really not an objective of the case method. Everything looks, pretty similar, a little better, a little worse. We run it in spring 2013 as a face-to-face course, and what we see is this same pattern. There really aren't an awful lot of differences, and replicate it one more time in fall of 2013, and as you can see, the 4 face-to-face offerings of the course are nearly indistinguishable, which suggests that this is a fairly reasonable instrument for measuring these things, because the differences between categories are a lot different than the differences within categories, and also they make sense. Understanding real-world issues is certainly something the case method should be good at. Improving technical skills is probably something that's really not an objective of the cases, though we do introduce some technologies in the cases, so that's pretty good. In summer 2014, we introduced the course as a pure online course using asynchronous discussions. Well, the asynchronous discussion method is a lot different from the face-to-face method, and I can tell you in advance that we saw our teaching evaluations for these classes drop about 0.3 points. We had done very well in these classes. 4.5 to 4.6 was the typical scores that Matt Malarkey and I had, which is very good for an undergraduate required course. And in the summer, it dropped to about 4.2. So when we did the student assessment of learning gains, what we were interested in is, were we going to see a similar drop there? In other words, is this just like teaching evaluations? So when we did the analysis and produced the numbers, we were really quite shocked. What shocked us is the fact that these numbers were essentially indistinguishable from all the face-to-face numbers and followed exactly the same patterns. And you don't need statistical analysis to tell you that. You can tell it by just eyeballing it. And once again, remember, this is an instrument where, according to the National Science Foundation, projects that use it, anything over 3 is considered quite good. So what this tells us is that we've been pretty faithful in replicating the learning results, at least as far as the students are concerned, when we took the course online, and we have the same pattern of learning. And I think that really needs to be our objective. Every time we move a course online, we want to do at least as well as the face-to-face version. Now, in some cases, we might see big differences in categories depending upon the organization, and that's okay as long as we do better online in some categories than we do face-to-face. But in this particular situation, it looks as if we actually replicated the face-to-face results, which once again I think is a very positive development. I'd like to wrap up this presentation with just some overall comments on my assessment of asynchronous case discussions. And from my experience, there are some important lessons to be learned. The first is that if you're going to design these discussions, you really want them to proceed in parallel. Don't try to mimic a classroom case discussion where you basically have a serial stream of issues. Run all the issues in parallel and let students discuss those issues that they're particularly interested in discussing in the discussion threads. Second thing is that students often prefer asynchronous. Now, when I've done studies of my graduate students, I always find that they say they like the classroom discussions best, they like the synchronous discussions second best, they like the asynchronous discussion least. However, if I change the question and say, which would you like to do next week, very often the class will vote for the asynchronous discussion because of the convenience and flexibility it gives you. And of course, if you're doing an online program and everything is required to be asynchronous, you don't have any choice in the matter. But what you should understand is that students can really buy into it if it is handled well. It is not necessarily a lesser substitute to the classroom. It takes a lot more time than a synchronous discussion. In a synchronous discussion, when you have the discussion going on, you're limited by class time, and the class is going to end whether or not you've covered everything you want to. In an asynchronous discussion, you got a week to cover things. You can intervene. You can ask students to look at different topics. These things can go on, but they take a lot more student time and a lot more faculty time. So if you were to, in a class that, say, discussed 2 cases a week, I would not recommend discussing more than 1 asynchronous case a week. In my classes, if I do 12 cases in a regular class, I might do 8 in an asynchronous class just to keep the workload reasonable, unless I adapt by changing other elements of the workload, which I sometimes do. Rather than doing fewer cases, I might have fewer external activities such as debates. If you are going to run these things, just understand they do put heavier demands on the students and the faculty, and you can inadvertently create too much work for yourself and for the students. I guess this is parallels. They take more time than synchronous discussions, both in terms of the calendar time and in terms of the amount of effort. The key thing with these discussions is to establish a pattern. I spend a lot more time grading the discussions early on than I do later in the semester, because once a pattern has been established, these discussions can operate fairly independently. And I have had a lot of these discussions where I did not make a single post because the students were doing fine on their own. And the key thing is that when you have a discussion like that, in the wrap-up, make it clear that the reason you didn't post is that they were doing a good job. And they can accept that, particularly if you have something like a video wrap-up or detailed feedback at the end, so that they know that you're involved and that you really care about the discussion. Finally, referring back to that last slide, asynchronous and synchronous discussions can achieve similar objectives. The asynchronous probably are significantly more work for the typical faculty member, but on the other hand, they do give you more flexibility. So which you use really depends upon how much you're willing to work in the class and how much you give up by not having the classroom discussions, because I will say that the classroom discussions are a lot more fun than the asynchronous discussions, but that does not mean that there has to be a huge learning differential. Well, I hope that sort of gives you an idea of the asynchronous discussions, and I hope you will really participate in the discussion that I've set up as if you were a student, and that way you'll get a much, much better feel for the kind of dynamics that your students are going through, and it'll make you a much better designer and facilitator of these discussions for your own courses.